Dave, on the passing of Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II, it's brought home a lot of things to a lot of people. But before we get into the emotional and sentimental side of things, as much as possible, I'd really like to stay on the practical. Can you explain to listeners what function does the crown actually perform? Because everyone says it's symbolic, and they think that means it's meaningless.
No, it's much more than symbolic. The Crown is the oldest institution in the country since the settlement, and it's very old in the United Kingdom too. It's old here, and it is an essential part of the constitutional system. The people of Australia agreed to unite in a federal commonwealth under the Crown and under the Constitution. And we adopted the Westminster system, which only emerged in Britain shortly before the Australian colonies, most of the colonies received self-government. And what that system involves is that the Crown retreated from any political involvement after George III, and the Crown has become the institution which does two things. First, it provides leadership above politics. In our societies, we have a leader who is above politics, rather than the situation in the United States where they have an elected president who tries to lead the nation, but is in many ways a divided figure because he comes from one of the other parties. We have a figure who comes from no parties. And we do that in Australia through the appointment of the governors and the Governor-General. And instead of having an election for them, which would produce yet another politician, what we do is we do it as we appoint judges. And the Prime Minister or the Premier goes to the Queen with a name, and they know that their reputation is at risk in this if they don't make a decent appointment. So they usually go out of their way to appoint someone of eminence who will perform that role in Australia. So what the Crown does is those two things. Firstly, providing leadership above politics, but also being a constitutional guardian. And there, the power of the Crown is not so much the power it wields, but the power it denies others. For many important things. The Prime Minister can't just take a decision and announce it. He has to go to the Governor-General for approval. For example, if you cast your minds back to when Mr. Turnbull sought the double dissolution, where both houses of Parliament go to the people, we don't have many, he had to go to the Governor-General. And if you look at the correspondence, which is accessible on the internet, look at the correspondence between Malcolm Turnbull and Sir Peter Cosgrave. You see Turnbull asking for permission for an election, and the Governor-General needing to be satisfied that the grounds were there, that there were bills which had been rejected twice by the Senate. There had to be at least one, but also importantly, that supply would be assured so that the government could continue until the new government was elected and in office. And that's important. It would mean that if the government didn't have supply, they wouldn't be able to use the money, the taxation money collected, for the paying of pensions, for the paying of the army and the navy and the air force and the other essential functions of government. And that had to be assured. And what the Governor-General required was an act to be passed to extend supply, which was running out, until the election was called. This gave Labor the opportunity of stopping the double dissolution. If they'd rejected supply in the Senate, there would have been no double dissolution. So we have this intricate system of checks and balances in which the Crown is important. The same thing applies in relation to the Governor-General. During the 1975 crisis, which was brought on by Mr. Whitlam not observing the constitutional requirements. understandingly, he was exasperated to have supply rejected another time. It had been rejected 18 months before. And I'm not saying that Fraser was right. In fact, I think in many ways he was wrong in withholding supply. But once supply was withheld, and Mr. Whitlam, as Prime Minister, was not able to assure the functions of government, he had an obligation to do one of two things. Either to resign and advise the Governor-General to call someone else to lead a government, or alternatively, and this was his best option, go to the Governor-General and advise an election so that he would go to the election as the Prime Minister. He declined to do either. He dragged it out. Eventually, we were approaching Christmas, supply would have run out, and the Governor-General acted. That was an important thing, and the Governor-General should always have that power.
Mm.
We need somebody there to have the power to ensure that the Constitution continues, that the Constitution is observed. And time again, at a lower level, governors and governors-general do things which show or advise the government that they should be doing something properly. In fact, for example, it was in the 80s, we decided, the government decided, the Hawke government decided to change the national anthem. And we adopted, after there'd been a plebiscite held under the Fraser government, and we adopted Advance Australia Fair as the national anthem, and God Save the Queen became the royal anthem. When the papers arrived at the Executive Council, the Governor-General noticed that there was something strange in the provision concerning the singing of the royal anthem, and it seemed to restrict from the wording. It was only to be authorized if the Queen or a member of the royal family were present. Just reading the document, it suggested that otherwise the singing or playing of God Save the Queen would be illegal. And the Governor-General said, "Do you really intend to do that?" And the government reply was, "No, we didn't intend it that way." A change was made by pen, by the minister, and you can see it on the original thing. There you see the Governor-General on a matter not of fundamental importance, but rather significant, because various organizations want to play God Save the Queen on appropriate occasions, and why shouldn't they if they want to? And they corrected this, and you see this, and it's initialed by the minister and then approved by the Governor-General in the Executive Council. We need a system in which there are checks and balances, and that's where the Crown is very important.
Yeah, and you see that's the folk wisdom, like put simply, that's in there, and that's a recognition that power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts, absolutely. See this pattern go right down through our entire system. Like as you know, I'm a former police officer. If a police officer wants to get a warrant to enter someone's house, or in certain cases arrest someone, they need to go to a justice of the peace, who is one of Her Majesty's representatives, a civilian representative of Her Majesty, and explain to that person why they need to enter that house, and on what grounds are they going to deprive that other citizen of their liberty. I think this is such an important pattern, and it really is reflected down our entire and down our entire system. And I totally, I mean, I get it, I think, but I think it's important psychologically too, because if you've got someone who's just won an election, during the celebrations and afterwards, there's no slave whispering in their ear, "But just a man, you're going to die." And I genuinely think, to help keep that person's feet on the ground, and I genuinely think that that's going to affect people. Like you see, and I'm not talking about any particular president in particular when I say this, you see the power of the office of president in the United States, because there's nothing above them, save God. You see that power go to their head, and I think psychologically that would be an incredible burden to bear. Can you talk about some, how this system evolved through history?
The British monarchy, which is the second oldest institution in Western Europe after the papacy, that evolved, but it was always a monarchy under the law and under God. That was always understood. And we have the great example of the Magna Carta, 1215, when the barons revolted, when the king claimed to exercise total authority. We have never had a system in the English-speaking world of an absolute monarchy. Even Henry VIII wasn't an absolute king. Contrast that with France, where we did have an absolute monarchy. The best example was Louis XIV, the Sun King, whose word was law. We've never had that system. But during that system gradually evolved. Even the Tudor kings and queens they still needed to call the parliament together, particularly if they wished to tax. But by the time of the Stuart kings, the 4 Stuart kings, a great dispute arose between the monarchy and the parliament. Laws by that time could only be made by parliament, that is the 2 houses, the House of Commons, the House of Lords, and the king coming together and signing an act of parliament. But the Stuart kings claimed what they called a dispensing power, that is, that they could relax the laws. Curiously, much the same as Mr. Biden is attempting to do in the United States. For example, he's ignoring the immigration laws and leaving the southern border open, and he is, in other ways, attempting to rule without Congress. But that's another system. But we saw this under the Stuart kings. It reached a head under Charles I, when there was a rebellion led by Cromwell, which resulted in the execution of the king, the trial and execution of the king, and the declaration of a republic, a protectorate under Oliver Cromwell, which itself failed, and the kings were called back. And the government under Charles II worked, but it certainly didn't under James II, who was fascinated by Louis XIV and wanted to impose in England an absolute monarchy like that of France. Eventually, James was forced to flee. He fled, and he threw the Great Seal into the Thames. That is the seal which was used to affix to laws and so on. That was treated as a effective abdication by the king, and they invited James's daughter, Mary, and her husband, who was the head of the Dutch Republic, and they invited William and Mary to come to England to become king and queen, joint monarchs, subject to their first approving a Bill of Rights, which was really setting out the rights of Parliament in the governing of England. And that was a dramatic moment, but that changed. After that, that was called the Glorious Revolution, sometimes the Bloodless Revolution, because it wasn't the normal sort of revolution where there's mass killings. It was pretty peaceful. And that Glorious Revolution resulted in the constitutional monarchy. But it was a different constitutional monarchy to the one we know today. I call it Constitutional Monarchy Mark I. And that was where laws could only be made by the 2 houses of Parliament and the king, but the king was still the head, the formal head, and in many ways the effective head of the government. The ministers were chosen by him. The ministers were responsible to the king. That continued until the American Revolution. We can't go into the reasons for that. But the king took the view, very strong view, that the colonies, which were the freest colonies the world has ever seen,
incidentally,
they took the view that the colonies could not rebel against acts of the British Parliament, including an act The British had defended the American colonies against the French, quite often with great Indian support. And the British felt that they had spent a lot of money, and they felt that the Americans, who hadn't contributed much money, but who'd contributed a lot in manpower, that they should contribute. And they tried to introduce taxation of the American colonies, which were pretty free. And the Americans revolted at that because they thought that they should be involved in any decision on taxes. And but George III, who was basically a good man, a decent man, George III took the view that Parliament was sovereign and that could not be breached, and he was a strong upholder of that. I think wiser minds in the British Parliament, particularly Edmund Burke, counselled against fighting the Americans, because it was even if it was won, it would mean that you'd have to have an army over there to control the colonists, and what was the point of that? So they eventually, as you know, the Americans eventually triumphed, and I think there was a realization that having the king as a political part of the Constitution wasn't such a good idea. Gradually, and these things take time, and there's a certain amount of trial and error. It's not some mad radical deciding what is to be done and suddenly imposing that on the people, or some academic in an ivory tower writing out a constitution and that becoming adopted. The approach in England, and to an extent in Australia, has been trial and error. Work out what is best, see how things go. Gradually, the idea developed through motions in the House of Commons that the Prime Minister was not so much responsible to the King. The Prime Minister was responsible to the House of Commons. That was the beginning of what we call the Westminster system. That is where governments rise and fall as to whether they command a majority in the lower house, the House of Representatives or the House of Commons. And that is the system we have today. The Crown, the King or Queen, retreated to being a leader above politics, not actively taking part in the government, but being there as a constitutional guardian. And that's the system we've inherited, and it works very well. It's probably it's certainly the oldest system in the world, and works very soundly, and was adopted in a large number of countries. Interestingly, it was adopted in a number of Arab countries where it worked very well until the army took over. It worked in Jordan, it worked in Egypt, in Libya, and you had effectively a constitutional monarchy. There was a similar thing in Afghanistan. Sometimes going around in taxis, I've had the occasion of chatting to the driver, and I've asked them, because I've realized they were an immigrant from one of those countries, Afghanistan or Egypt, and I said, well, what was it like before? And I remember one Afghan taxi driver referring to the reign of King Mohammed. He said that was a golden age. That was a wonderful age, because he was a very good king, ruled more as a constitutional monarch than an absolute monarch, and Afghanistan thrived. Women dressed as they wished and sought education, and he said that was a golden age. Similarly, I've spoken to Egyptian drivers and Egyptian immigrants who told me that their parents told them, notwithstanding how undiligent King Farouk was, the times then were really a golden age in Egypt. Things went very well under constitutional monarchies. The style of constitutional monarchy is a very wise system of government. And the way we choose our local head of state, the Governor-General is the head of state.
Yeah.
In 1907, the High Court, consisting mainly of judges who had worked on the drafting of the Constitution, decided or stated unanimously in a case in 1907 that the Governor-General is the constitutional head of the Commonwealth. So we have the King as sovereign, we have the Governor-General as the head of state, and he the court went on to refer to the governors as the heads of state of the various states. But this is a wonderful system. And the way we appoint them, more like judges than having to elect them, is a much more effective way. It's not well known, but during the first Constitutional Convention, there was a proposal that the Constitution be so worded that it would be open in later years to turning the Governor General's position into an elected position. That was overwhelmingly rejected.
No.
It was rejected in committee. It didn't even have to go to the full convention. There was a revulsion in the idea of having in Australia what would effectively be a president, an elected president, coexisting with the parliament, and it would be something like the present French Fifth Republic. And remember, the French only have the present Fifth Republic because they couldn't make the other four work. They couldn't make the two empires work. They couldn't make the 3 or 4 monarchies work. So they now have a Fifth Republic, and it attempts to bridge the American Republic with the English system of responsible government, but it doesn't work, and it blows up every few years.
Yeah, there is deep folk wisdom in this system, and I think it's because the power is diffuse. It's put down the system. But having made that call,
that's why you should have an upper house in Queensland.
Oh yeah, of course.
And the politicians. It's worth reminding Queenslanders that the Queenslanders voted overwhelmingly to keep the Legislative Council, and then the politicians soon after found a way to get rid of it. And it doesn't necessarily mean you have more politicians. You just reduce the size of the lower house and have a different way of choosing the upper house. Thereby, you remove the dictatorship in Brisbane that you presently have.
I don't want to walk too much down that because, as you know, it's something I'm quite passionate about. You know, out of the 93 state electorates in Queensland, 73 are within a 250-kilometre radius of the Brisbane CBD.
That is a terrible thing. You're absolutely right. Same in New South Wales. Same in Victoria. So you get these bulging, overcrowded capitals in the continent, which is the most sparsely populated in the world. And what we do need, and you're very much in support of this, what we do need are more states, because this is the only way to diffuse power. And what we saw in COVID, we saw 2 terrible things in COVID. In colonial times, when we were self-governing, but in colonial times in Brisbane, in Sydney, and Melbourne, and Adelaide, Perth, Hobart, we had a very effective executive council. When governments wanted to make regulations, and regulations are laws, they're not to be trifled with.
That's right.
When they wanted to make regulations, they went to the executive council. The governor wouldn't make a decision on the merits, but what the governor would do would check that the process was right. Something like an explanatory memorandum would come, and the governor would need to be persuaded that he had the power to do what the minister was proposing. And we know from recent cases that sometimes regulations are made outside of power. They go far beyond the enabling act.
Of course, absolutely.
We saw that with the export ban, the export cattle ban, which greatly affected the part of Queensland where you live.
Absolutely.
But, what we have done, and it is a scandal, and ACM, Australia's Constitutional Monarchy, have this at the top of our list, because we're saying, what do you want to, why are you worrying about these other constitutional issues? You've got 2 referendums lined up. The real issue is what happened, and it was exposed under COVID. And what was happening was that ministers, in the middle of the night, obviously with the connivance of the Premier, were making regulations. We had one regulation in New South Wales in the middle of the COVID pandemic, where the minister suddenly closed down the building industry in New South Wales. It went on for about 2 weeks. It cost $1.25 billion. A lot of people lost their jobs, and all sorts of works were were thrown out of sync, they created enormous problems. And the chief health officer said, I didn't advise this. We don't know where the advice came. Had it been done properly in the Executive Council with a proper memorandum, explanatory memorandum, we would have known whether this was within the powers of the legislation to make regulations. And we would have also known whether there were any conditions on the exercise of that power and whether those conditions were fulfilled. Yeah. This is what is essential. But the other important thing in the matter of regulations is it was assumed, you can't write everything into your constitution, but it was assumed, it was the practice, even in colonial times, that when a regulation was made, it then had to be laid before both houses, and either house could disallow the regulation. Another check and balance. That's been swept away by legislation. The Senate must have been asleep, absolutely asleep, as were many of the legislative councils, the upper houses. They let through legislation saying this is not a disallowable instrument. So a number of the decisions taken by the Federal Minister for Health, decisions with enormous consequences, couldn't be disallowed. There's been a Senate report on this which says this. This is the major constitutional issue in Australia today, to restore the working of the Constitution, the constitutional checks and balances. They're still there in part, but no significant regulation should be made in Australia without it going to the Executive Council, with the governor sitting there with the ministers, and an explanatory memorandum which must be made public. Why were those ridiculous models containing errors presented to the unconstitutional National Cabinet? It doesn't exist in the Constitution.
That's exactly right.
We need to restore the constitutional system. It's been whittled away by the politicians.
It has.
Absolutely.
And some activist judges too, David.
And yes, you're so right, and activist judges. And this has to be placed under control. This is more important than this voice or this republic, some sort of republic that they're going to propose in the second or third term.
I speak to a lot of people, as many people as I can, who are don't agree with me. So I speak to sovereign citizens. I speak to some very left-wing people. I talk to all these people, and there's one consistent theme when I'm talking to all of these people, either in interviews like this, or online or face-to-face when I'm kind of catching up. And that's this idea that the system isn't working. Now, that's not 100% true, because we still live in some of the best times and all that kind of stuff. But I do understand the instinct. But my argument, being an instinctual conservative, is that, yes, it's true. Your voice has been eroded away. Like, it's not that we have no representation, so it's not exactly the same as the Americans, no taxation without representation. Well, I mean, 20 representatives in Parliament, and that's really not adequate representation. So that's true. You can't rationally argue it. You can't come out and go, oh my God, no, you have adequate representation. No, we don't. That's the reason that I'm kind of involved in this. So
the elections are confected. What's happened in Australia is the two major political parties have captured the system of representative democracy. I don't know if it's as bad in Queensland as it is in New South Wales.
It is.
What has effectively happened is that they have ensured that pre-selections are captured, and the great tendency in pre-selections on both sides is that the person chosen is not necessarily the one with merit. The person chosen is the one in allegiance to the relevant power broker. And I think I've seen that all the time.
So to put things into context, to apply that understanding like to our constitutional monarchy. So that would be like the Prime Minister, rather than having, because as you said before, that there's been this evolutionary change. Previously, the Prime Minister had to impress the King. Then it evolved to the Prime Minister having to impress and get the consensus of the House of Commons. They're two very different things there. Now, basically, again, we have this weird thing where the king calling, equating the party or the party power brokers to a king, and I don't think that that's kind of inaccurate. Like the king is putting their man into saying, no, you represent me in Parliament.
Yes,
representing Parliament. That is completely changing things upside down. So again, everywhere we have this pattern where all of these people seem to want to be sun kings. They want to be, they don't want to be Queen Elizabeth II. They want to be Louis XIV, all of them.
Oh, you're so right. There's a wonderful saying by Jefferson. It's attributed to him, but it's consistent with what he wrote, and that is that there are two enemies of the people. They are criminals and governments. And governments have to therefore be chained down by the Constitution, because if they're not, they will develop into a legitimate version of criminality.
Yeah.
That's the danger. We've got to control governments. The Swiss, I think, have the best way of controlling governments, and that is a healthy dose of direct democracy. The Swiss can at any time, by a petition of a certain number of Swiss people, initiate a referendum which can be binding on the government, on the legislature. And interestingly, there's one interesting matter in the Swiss constitution. The Supreme Court is forbidden to interpret the Constitution. Forbidden to interpret the Constitution. And that is because the people control the Constitution by changing it when they wish through referendums. They initiate referendums. Our founders were very good in introducing the referendum. They made, I think, a serious error in only allowing the federal parliament, or at best one house can do it, of the federal parliament to initiate a referendum. It should have also been given to a number of states. They should have said 2 states, for example, can initiate a federal referendum, 2 or 3 states. And they should have said, as the then Prime Minister of South Australia wanted, it should also be able to be initiated by a certain number of citizens of Australia. Why not? Why should Mr. Albanese decide, or Mr. Whitlam or Mr. Morrison decide what's going to be in the referendum? Why shouldn't we decide what's going to be in the next referendum? And if we don't like a High Court interpretation of the Constitution, why shouldn't we put that up to the people?
Where's the democracy?
Yes.
Where is the democracy?
Yes.
And that goes back to what I was saying before. Here's something like, I get it when all the weirdo socialists who are spray painting, as much as I loathe them, they're destroying, they're destroying statues and all that kind of stuff. And they're sitting there saying, I feel powerless. My voice is not being listened to. I find myself going, yes, I totally get it. I mean, we both mean very different things. Like they genuinely want to raise things back and, start off at ground zero, and there's some utopian vision in their heads they think is going to work, and deny all the folk wisdom of centuries of blood and centuries of sweat, centuries of thought, throw all that away because, hey, you've got a gender studies major. Sure, yes, you have the wisdom to solve all the world's problems. And these people genuinely believe that. But as foolish as that is, I get it. And when you're getting this sense of powerlessness creeping across tie-wearing, queen-loving conservatives and petrol bomb-throwing, well, I suppose I can't see Vladimir Lenin bearded people because, I'm kind of like that. But you understand what I'm trying to imply there. But there's something going on here, and
I think people are justified in being irritated.
Yeah.
I long ago came to the conclusion, and I asked people about this. I say there is no significant problem in Australia today which, if it weren't created by the politicians, has been made significantly worse by them. No problem at all. And they say, well, what about the weather? And I say, well, the problems of the weather in a land of droughts and sweeping floods, what we expect from the politicians is to do what was being done until the Hawke government stopped it, and that is to have a vigorous program of building dams, of moving the water around from where it falls to where it's needed. And we've had marvelous plans for that. The Bradfield, the Beale, and the Biggs plan, the Bridges plan in Western Australia. He was an Indigenous, by the way, only Bridges. But there were plans to do this, and that's what we should be doing. We have been left by the politicians to be defenseless. We don't have, against a hostile power. The hostile power is obviously Beijing, Communist China.
Yeah.
Without the Americans, we would be completely taken over and we'd be cut off. In fact, that book by General Molan demonstrates that we probably won't even know about it, because one of the first things they do is cut the cables which bring the internet to Australia, and we'd be in difficulties in getting communication. It'd be very easy to cut off the petrol, because our politicians have not done what Billy Hughes started the colonial oil refineries with Anglo-Iranian oil, I think, and we started refining a lot of oil in Australia. But we have a very brief period of available oil in Australia. A lot of our reserves are in the United States. A great help if the Chinese have blocked access to Australia because of their very large navy. Now, the politicians create, wherever they go, they create disasters because they've rigged the system. And what they've got are not ordinary people as politicians. These are acolytes who go straight from the university. Even while they're at the university, they're working for politicians. All they're thinking of is, how can I get a seat? So they need a power broker who's a prince who arranges the pre-selection, and they get a seat in parliament. That's the rigged system. We've got a class of politicians who are running this country, and they really need to be controlled.
They're undermining democracy. And I don't think they get where this is going to end. There's only, like, if democracy allows, and having all these systems, and I know a little bit about this, having kept the peace for a few years, but if you can't have a way of resolving disputes peacefully, well, there's only one alternative. Do you think that Her Majesty's death and all this emotion that it's caused out, because we've talked about the rational kind of side of thing and, you know, what it kind of means when it plays out, but do you think that this will make us emotionally and sentimentally realize that we actually have something really precious to guard here? Like, are you optimistic?
I think in all people, there's a spiritual side, even though the number of people who are going to the traditional religions, going to the services, has obviously declined. But I think we are designed to believe as well as have a rational part of our mind. And that's why I think people are grasping onto these ridiculous dogmas and beliefs which are coming out, particularly from foreign universities, American universities, English universities. The obsession with climate change, for example, and now gender and Black Lives Matter, all these ridiculous theories, some of which are so factually wrong that they shouldn't even be espoused. But I think people need to believe in something. And I think the Queen had the monarchy has a very strong spiritual side. And you need only go to the coronation service, which is going to fascinate people. They're going to find this when it's filmed. The modern generation are just going to be amazed by the coronation, because it is an essentially religious service, and it goes back to our Judeo-Christian origins, particularly that wonderful, it's now set to music by Handel, Zadok the priest.
Oh, yeah.
And that will, before, and the most solemn part of the coronation is not, and there's a couple of journalists saying the Queen was coronated. It's not the crowning. It's not the crowning, it is the anointing, because it goes right back to the Old Testament, anointing and setting aside of the king or queen as a special officer who has in many ways a spiritual side. And I think there will be an increased return.
How do you think Charles will go?
Well, I thought that his speech was magnificent, particularly his promise to govern according to constitutional principles, and that the issues which were very close to his heart will not be issues on which he will have much time to spend. His charities and other issues he mentioned, which obviously meant climate change. I think his environmental parts of his attention to the environment has been good. I like very much his beliefs in architecture. I believe that he's a good man. I think that some of his beliefs were misguided. I think I have confidence that he will keep away from that area. As I say, there's no significant problem in Australia, which, if it were not caused by the politicians, has been made significantly worse by them. No problem at all in this country. And we have to, only the people could do it. We have to do something about it. There is a solution, and that is to insist on a system of some good addition of direct democracy. We should have the right to initiate referendums to rule this country and to make the politicians accountable, which they're not.